this new journey where we're still doing the work, still having very necessary conversations, even though COVID-19 has just come and wreaked havoc on all of the plans that we thought that we were going to have, but the movement still continues. I just want to set some norms. So the chat box is open. So if you have questions throughout this event, you can shoot those questions into the chat box. We do ask for everyone to represent this beautiful Black and brown space. So questions will be moderated just to make sure that we are on topic and really making best of this platform this evening. All right, to give you a rundown of how tonight will work, we're gonna go back and connect with our ancestors and with our elders who actually started this movement. Part of doing the EJ movement right, when you convene, you first give tribute to the ancestors. Specifically for Black people, African people, Indigenous people, we are very much so connected to the earth and very so connected to the spirit of the people who did a lot of work for us to actually be resilient and stand where we are today to carry the torch forward. So we're gonna begin this evening's event with our poet laureate. She's our inaugural poet laureate, and I know that that's really, really cool to have, especially within the environmental justice space. So we're really excited to have her to open up and make sure that we pay tribute to those who paved the way for us. So it is my honor to introduce virtually to you all, Miss Lavinia Tribble.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. I am glad to be with you all tonight, and I will be reciting my original poem, Paying to be Poisoned. Paying to be Poisoned by Lavinia Tribble. The darker the berry, the sweeter the juice, the darker the person, the tighter the noose. Will it ever stop the systemic elimination of a group of people? What people? Black people, brown people, poor people, your people, my people, our people. This sounds like genocide. The darker the berry, the sweeter the juice. The darker the person, the tighter the noose. For over 6 years now, the citizens of Flint, Michigan have paid to be poisoned. They have paid their water bill, however, have received highly corrosive and contaminated water to bathe with, to shower with, to wash their hands with, to cook with, to clean with, paying to be poisoned. The darker the berry, the sweeter the juice. The darker the person, the tighter the noose. Guilty as charged. First-degree murder. Governor Snyder knew and did nothing. He allowed the water to be the trigger. Will the government officials be held accountable for what they did? Will they be held accountable for the children, for the innocent children that were poisoned with lead? The darker the berry, the sweeter the juice. The darker the person, the tighter the noose. Black and brown people are suffering at a higher mortality rate of COVID-19 due to underlying health issues. Lead is toxic and affects the brain, heart, bones, kidney, nervous, reproductive systems, causing brain damage and behavioral issues. Lead poisoning is an underlying health condition. This is environmental racism. The darker the berry, the sweeter the juice. The darker the person, the tighter the noose. Thank you.
All right, if we could give just some snaps. Wasn't that a powerful way to start this conversation? It is so relevant to the time that we are living in right now, whether it be from police brutality to environmental justice. There's always something that we have to fight against that's grounded in white supremacy and racism. Thank you so much, Lavinia, for sharing your ministry with us and just setting the tone for the much needed conversation around making sure that we get back to the roots, back to the essentials, back to who actually started this movement. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward into the conversation. I just want to say this is a Black and Brown millennial space, so it very much so is going to be organic, a real cool vibe. Okay, so just relax, relate, release. You know, it's not going to be real stuffy. You know, all prim and proper. We definitely want to make sure that this is a safe space for folks. And again, you can drop your questions off throughout this conversation. We're all family in here tonight. So we're going to actually begin. If I can get our wonderful panelists for this evening to introduce themselves. So if you just take about 30 seconds to just tell us who you are, so all these beautiful people who have joined us this evening can be connected with you. So we'll first start with the William Barber III.
Thank you so much, LaTricea. I'm so glad to be on with each of you tonight. My name is William Barber III. I'm from Durham, North Carolina. I serve as the Strategic Partnerships Manager of the Climate Justice Initiative at Climate Reality Project, as well as work with the North Carolina Poor People's Campaign as the Ecological Devastation Co-Chair. Say I'm a country boy. I'm a son of the South, North Carolina. We were just joking. I'm from Bull City. Went to school at North Carolina Central University. So Eagle Pride all day. Okay. And then later went on to get my law degree from UNC Chapel Hill. So glad to be on with you all.
All right, that's beautiful. All of those accolades and accomplishments, but remains humble. Yes, brother. Thank you for joining the conversation. All right, we are going to move to a lovely introduction of Ms. Dominique Primer.
Good evening, everybody. I am Dominique Primer. I am a candidate for Tennessee House District 84 here in Shelby County and representing Memphis. I am new to the environmental justice space, but I understand how necessary it is to talk about environmental racism. I hold a bachelor's degree from Hampton University in political science and a master's in public administration and international relations. So happy to join you and talk about some very important things and how it's impacting our communities.
Awesome. And last but certainly not least, our other panelist joining us this evening is Miss Gabbi Martinez. Come off of mute.
Hey, everybody. My name is Gabrielle Martinez. You guys can call me Gabbi. I am the founder and executive director of the Black Girl Tribe. Shameless plug at the Black Girl Tribe. Check us out. I'm from Washington, D.C. I am of Latinx and Black descent. My father is from Venezuela, so I am the first person born in my family in this country. I'm a dreamer. I'm at a lot of intersections. So I'm really excited to be here. Thank you, LaTricea. Thank you, Black Millennials for Flint. And thank you to my panelists. I already vibe with y'all. We lit some sage before y'all came in here. So I'm excited for the conversation to come.
Awesome. So we are ready to go ahead and get this party started. And we're going to start with a real uncomfortable conversation starter, shall we? All right, so opening up this conversation, can we talk about why the environmental justice space is so white? The environmental justice space looks nothing like this collection of beautiful Black and brown people that we see here. Why do we think that is? Anybody can start.
Can I start?
Yeah, go ahead, sis.
I definitely want to just go ahead and just drop the truth bomb, because white people think they run everything, and the planet included. So saving the planet also feels like their cause to take over as well. And a lot of times, like in every other situation, we are pushed out of the way or discounted for our efforts when Black and brown people are some of the most resilient, upcycling people on this planet. Tell me your mama don't got a plastic bag full of plastic bags, right? And we don't have the expense to throw away the things that everybody else throws away. We have had to be resilient. Jugs of juice have gone to be jugs of water and jugs of tea and had different other kinds of things. So I think a lot of times we downplay our activism because we don't necessarily know how to recognize it, or in the words of a Yanla, call a thing a thing. But essentially that is what we're doing. So we're in it. It's just more time for us to reclaim that space, reclaim our power in it. And, you know, just like reading the acts and the actions that we want people to take and really come out of this conversation with, the earth already belongs to us and it still belongs to us. And once we tap into that power, we'll see, you know, organizations like Black Millennials for Flint coming up. We'll see more Black and brown youth feeling the ability to reclaim this space and start more social justice movements that are environmentally. You muted, boo.
There we go. Ooh, the seasoned millennials. Yes, but that's definitely the truth. It makes me think about long ago, like in middle school, and we started to learn about manifest destiny, and about this whole mentality around conquering, and just capture. And many of those things still play out today, especially as it relates to the planet that we live in. Dominique, can you kind of touch bases on your thoughts about just why do we not see in these major green organizations more Black and brown people?
I think it's because they would have to admit that they're responsible for a lot of the things that we experience as Black and brown people. And so when you don't want to have to navigate the difficult conversations with the people that you have put in harm, knowingly put in harm, and in trying to correct the things that you've done, you usually don't include them, because then that makes that responsibility that much more serious. So when we're not invited into those spaces, then there's nobody to hold them accountable. And so we can just feel good about whatever it is that we say that we're doing to address the issues, instead of actually doing the work with the people who have their foot on a pulse and know what's happening in their communities and how they're being impacted.
Absolutely. William, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I tend to think in threes. So, I mean, I think three buckets are this false narrative, you know, where there still exists a false narrative that Black and brown folks aren't concerned about the environment, you know, and data has shown that as recently as 2018. You know, there was a research article by Adam Pearson that found in a national survey, whites and non-whites had this stereotype that environmental issues were largely a white issue, and they associated the term environmentalist with whites and affluent leaders. You know, the truth of the matter is that the environmental movement has historically failed in the framing of the issue, which is what has led to these stereotypes. You know, traditionally, the environmental movement has framed our environmental crisis as solely a technical issue or solely a policy issue, and has ignored how those issues intersect with the social, racial, and economic disparities, you know, that hit us in our communities. You know, I think a second reason are the barriers that have historically existed in the environmental space. The lack of career pathways for leaders of color, the inadequacy of diversity efforts in environmental nonprofits, and the segregation of resources from environmental justice groups who are leading this work, powerful work on the ground. You know, when you talk about the lack of career pathways, the only reason I've been able to go as deep in the environmental field as I am is because I had the opportunity to have mentors, but also access to internships, right? Where I was able to get experience, also access to training, you know, where I was able to further hone my skill set, you know, also access to job interviews, right? You know, where I was able to actually not only study this, you know, with my college degree, but go to a place and work in my field of study, you know? And then the final piece I would say is the difference and the barrier between recruitment and retention. I think diversity has become a buzzword in recent history, and lots of groups are focusing on, you know, how do we increase diversity as a part of our programming? And too often we stop at the first step of recruitment, right? Just getting people in the door. We don't ask the hard questions of how we're changing organizational culture, right? To help foster retention of emerging leaders of color, you know, in this space. And that leads to exhaustment, that leads to high turnover rates, and people just getting frustrated with the process.
You just gave a whole word. I think about what really resonated with me, what you talked about is the whole thing around diversity. And it really is just a con, to be honest. When we talk about diversity, it's really important, especially in majority white organizations, to get the clear understanding of what does diversity mean to you, right? So are you talking about gender diversity? Are you talking about putting white women in positions of leadership? Technically, that's diversity. Are you specifically talking about Black people from African descent, indigenous people, Latino people? With Latino people, are you also being inclusive of dark-skinned Latino people? When we think about the history of how cultures came to be, we can't ignore the fact that you could very much have direct lineage from colonizers, right? So when you show up in these spaces and you talk about Black or brown people, are they really Black and brown people, or are they white adjacent? So I really love that you brought that up. Like I said to everybody that's viewing, we were definitely going to open this up with all transparency. It's a much needed conversation so that we can be more intentional about our work. All right. So, y'all got me all motivated. Yes, yes. Gabbi got the stage back there. I feel it all in the atmosphere all the way down here. All right. So moving into the next question. Can we talk about how did the civil rights movement kind of give birth to the environmental justice movement? And we'll actually start with William to kind of give your opinion on the connection to the civil rights movement.
Yeah, thanks, LaTricea. I think historically there has always been a keen awareness, right, of the environmental issues, environmental crisis within civil rights activism. A quote that comes to mind for me is by James Farmer Jr., one of the famous civil rights leader, who actually said around the 1960s that if we do not save the environment, everything we hope to do with voting rights, everything we hope to do with civil rights, everything we hope to do with addressing poverty will be for naught, because we will all experience the equality of extinction. So I think that is an example of how leaders in our communities have always had this intersectional lens, right, of multiple issues and the way they compound upon our communities. I think of Dr. King, when he talked about from 1967 to 1968, the three evils of racism, militarism, and poverty. That multi-issue analysis helped form the basis of what we're working on in the Poor People's Campaign today, where we actually have added the evil of ecological devastation and the environmental crisis, as a part of our agenda. And then when you look at the timing of the rise of the American environmental movement, which has been timed to start as early as the 1960s or 70s, that activism, that energy was directly linked to the civil rights activism of the same period. In fact, February 11th, 1968, that's the Memphis sanitation strikes that Dr. King led. That was regarded nationwide as the first time African Americans mobilized a national, broad-based group to oppose what they considered environmental injustice, and one of the first actions opposing environmental injustice in this country. And there, of course, we know that Dr. King was working to advocate for better working conditions and pay for striking Memphis, Tennessee garbage workers. Fast forward to September 1982. What happened then? That's the Warren County sit-ins, right? Which was seen as the second time African Americans mobilized on a national scale, in nonviolent sit-in protests against a PCB landfill in Warren County, North Carolina. And that is largely seen as the catalyst, the initial birthplace, right, of the American or United States environmental justice movement. And we know that many of the leaders there they cut their tooth. They honed their activism in the civil rights movement of the 60s. And then I'm big on timelines. So just making sure we see the direct time linkage between these dates. In June 1983, prompted by the Warren County sit-ins, that's when we had the United States General Accounting Office conduct a study entitled Siting of Hazardous Waste Landfills, right? And the first time they made the correlation between racial and economic status of surrounding communities. The first time data was used, right, to uphold the truth. 1987, you had the United Church of Christ Commission on Racial Justice. 1990, the Congressional Black Caucus July 1990, the EPA administrator created the Environmental Equity Workshop. And then, of course, October 1991, right? That's when we get the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, where we get the 17 Principles of Environmental Justice. So when you look at history, right, there's a direct link in terms of activism, leadership, but also the events that led to the birth of the environmental justice movement rooted in the civil rights movement.
Now tell the truth, how many people learned something in that piece from William? I know, right? So that's why I wanted to open up this evening by just getting down to the core of it, like knowing that Black people, brown people, because it even makes me think about the labor rights that we have today and the influence of Cesar Chavez. All of that was going on concurrently during the civil rights movement. And here we are in 2020, and when we have these environmental justice symposium, these large convenings where you see Black people and brown people, indigenous people being in the quote unquote minority, how is it, that we kind of started this revolution and then, are becoming more and more invisible? So thank you for kind of schooling us from a historical perspective around how Black and brown people have been about it. We have definitely been ingrained and raised in an environmental perspective. Just connecting back to what Gabbi talked about, my grandma and my mom, they are the best composters, conservationists, but people bring about these Eurocentric type of terminologies, these terms that makes it appear like you're not really connected to this movement. So thank you for sharing that. We did have one question before we transition in to some other part of the conversation. Thank you to Ms. Marquita Bradshaw. She is actually a legacy environmentalist from the great city of Memphis, Tennessee. She said to the panelists, anyone can answer, can you speak about how the funding industrial complex is discriminatory when funding grassroots-led organizations who may not be academics, quote unquote? Anybody want to tackle that one? Because there's going to be some truth serum coming out of that one.
I can't speak to every organization's cause or mission and purpose and how they represent it in the best light, but I can speak for mine. And then specifically in coming out in an organization where our sole mission is literally the betterment of Black girls, I come up on so many obstacles for funding and for donors and for people to find themselves in my movement, because it seems like it's very polarizing, but it's not, because it should be something that you should be apologetic about caring about, specifically because Black women and girls the stats are there, right? Let's not get more depressed. Like, the stats are there. And when it comes to funding, when we're so unapologetic about wanting to do holistic programming, not just academic bolstering or HIV testing or long-acting reversible contraception education, when we want to talk about their roots, when we want to talk about vision boarding, when we want to give Black girls mindfulness at a stage and when things are going crazy and meditation would be vital for them in their environments, right? These things are seen as unfounded, they can't find the data. They can't find that it's important enough. They can't see any change. They can't see any marketable change, right? So pretty much what they're saying is they can't see the importance in empowering little Black girls, right? In a way that is authentic to them. If I use some kind of curriculum that they designed with their best intentions, right? And then I could probably find funding. But if it's because something that, like you said, grassroots, something that I'm using from my own life experience, from my staff's collective experience of being Black women and making it through girlhood, right? Things that we've authentically designed with a consciousness, with a mental aid first health concept being our forefront for programming for Black youth, instead of just being the stereotype, we got y'all. Shout out to Issa Rae for shouting out the nonprofit industrial complex, right? Because that's what happens. Essentially, you know, what we have to start doing is finding our own funding. Like Black people have to start becoming philanthropists. Stop buying Birkins and send me some monies for these kids to buy books. Because essentially the money is there, the wealth is there. Prince George's County is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. However, there's not that many nonprofits offering free, authentically, holistically free programming, right? But there's a lot of Jack and Jill. So there's no shade to those organizations, but if you're going to be selective in your membership, make sure that the funding that you're allotting for the programming that you're doing over there is also being trickled down to the hood too, because clearly no one is out here giving to the programs that are not as selective and membership based, right? And that's not shade, because, you know, everybody needs a friend, everybody needs a club. But essentially right now, when you have organizations trying to do the work and we see that they are not going to fund it, but we see that it's a vital service, it's now our responsibility to get it done. And it's our responsibility to fund those in the ways that we need to resource them and to support them. Because if you have an elected official that is in charge of a budget for youth programming, and you know that there's an organization out here struggling, you have the voice to say, hey, did you ever go and see what that program over there is doing, how effective they're being? Because your results, or how you perceive the results, also matter. And we have to get out of this data-centered, you know, what do the numbers say idea of programming, because it's not effective for our kids. It's still sending them to jail. It's still not getting them to college. It's still not getting them into jobs and careers. It's not giving them anything else to hope for, but people are still being paid, and I'm confused.
Yes, go off, sis. There's another point that I want to bring up too before we transition that just has to be said. When you have Black-led and Latino-led organizations, it is imperative for us to do more coalition building and more organizing together, especially when it comes from a funding perspective. We literally are fighting for the exact same things. And we have to be honest and say that we observe literally organizations that are competing against each other. It shouldn't be that way. You know, we're literally thinking about the people who are holding these strings to funding. Many of them are off the backs of slaves about why they even have this money to begin with. We have to keep the core mission involved is to defeat white supremacy, period. That's what all of this is grounded in. And when we start to, you know, say, my issue is bigger than your issue, all of the issues are issues, right? So I think that we need to start moving in that direction. We can't ignore that it's bad blood that exists from a historical perspective because of the concept of capitalism intersecting into this space. I was on a panel a couple of weeks ago, and they talked about how the environmental justice movement became too professionalized. It started to move away from the aspects of grassroots. And so now it operates very much so like corporate America. That wasn't the impetus of why this movement started. So I wanted to put that little piece in there also. We're gonna transition the conversation a little bit. So this is going to be a question. I'm kind of going out of sequence a little bit here, but I think this is a good transition. So this is to any other panelists. So one thing, and I'll have to, you know, take ownership for this too. When we look at Black-centered movements, there are not a lot of organizations, including our legacy organizations, our legacy civil rights organizations that focus on immigration reform or focus on just the impact of all sorts of discrimination, whether it be racial discrimination, whether it be xenophobia that's associated with immigrants, our immigrant brothers and sisters. Can we talk about how we can be more strategic with making sure that we are inclusive in our movements when we think about people who are just trying to live a better life in the United States to a land that don't belong to none of us except for Native Americans? Can anybody speak to that? We'll go with Dominique. What are your thoughts?
I knew you was coming to me. I I have a lot of thoughts about this, but I'll try and keep them brief. I think the biggest thing that we can do is, one, acknowledge that we are all in this shared space of being underrepresented and under-resourced, and that we have to come together and collectively think about how we are going to get the resources that we need. And so often I hear people talk about equity and, we need to allocate, equitable resources, and I'm guilty of that as well. But as I've learned over the past couple of years, is that it's not about equity, but that we really need to get to a place of justice, and that justice looks different for everybody, right? Justice looks different for Black people. It looks different for Latinx people. But what is not different is the oppression that we feel by being under-resourced. And so when we think about what it means to get what we need, just to have the fundamentals of life to be viewed as human and not less than, then we're able to really collaborate and build out infrastructures that are specific for Black and brown people. I have had people in my family say the biggest mistake that Black people ever asked for was desegregation and integration, that we were fully prosperous without having outside resources, and so prosperous that we were attacked. Black Wall Street was burned down, we were bombed, They do not want us to have resources, but I think that we have to decide to do it for ourselves, right? We know that these systems are not going to allow us to disrupt them and dismantle them peacefully. We can't have peaceful protest anymore. That has become a problem. And so we've got to figure out, what is it going to take for us to start realizing that we already have the power, we already have the resources, but how do we maximize that to our own benefit? And stop letting people tell us that we can't, right? So there's a lot of people who opt out because they feel that the systems are not for them. They were never for you, they'll never be for you. And so we just have to figure out how we're going to do what we have intrinsically done in the first place. We've always been resilient. We've always found a way to do what it takes for us to thrive. And so for me, that looks like, and I'll just use my swim team as an example. When there was not a space for Black and brown swimmers, I created one. I didn't need for someone to fund that structure for me. I knew where the resources were. I knew that I was qualified to do that. And so a lot of the time it is those who have the knowledge and the capacity to go out and be a conduit for those in their communities to get up and do it. And that's how we can start to build some collaboration and really combat the things that we see for underrepresentation for both communities.
Yes, you just spoke a word, Dominique. I think it's really important for us to understand the many different perspectives of oppression. I think sometimes when we think about oppression from a very isolated perspective, it becomes oppression observed in a vacuum, right? So I think really becoming intentional about being as inclusive as possible to those people who are historically disenfranchised outside of just ourselves, right? I want to keep coming back to the point about, it's not just Black people, it's not just Latino people, it's not just Indigenous people in isolation. It's literally all of us together that are experiencing these same types of oppression, especially as it relates to environmental justice.
And it's not, it shouldn't be a victim Olympics, right? It shouldn't be that my oppression is worse than your oppression. We should get to a space where, if we understand that people of color collectively are the majority, right? It's when we separate and silo ourselves into I'm Black or I'm Indigenous or I'm this, that we don't really get the chance to build on what it means to be to become a majority.
Agreed. William, any thoughts on that piece?
Yeah, I would say, first, speaking of the legacy orgs, the unpopular opinion is, I think, and you all have touched on this, we got to challenge some of the latent xenophobia that exists there, where we pitch the different oppressions, and I've seen people pitch the Black community against the brown community, right? And say, who has it worse, or even this notion of, oh, they're coming here to, all these crazy talking points that we hear, right? We have to resist that and challenge that in every form. I think we got to be careful in understanding that when we say what we're fighting is the manifestations of white supremacy, understand that that's a sinister system. And it's a system. It's not individuals that we're fighting. Though there are bad apples, it's a system. And that is a battle of attrition. And you got to be careful. Otherwise, it will have you fighting your potential allies, you know, brown communities. And I'll say also some white allies who don't know what it means to stand in solidarity, you know, and we have to be careful about how we do that. The other piece is I think we need to understand fully the policy violence, right? When we talk about the impacts on our communities, to understand the situations. You know, I geek out on this stuff. I have a bachelor's in environmental physics and law degree. You know, when you look at the data, it shows that these communities are hit the most. 71% today of African Americans and 80% of Latinos live in counties that violate federal air pollution standards. What does that mean? That means higher rates of air pollution. That means more health disparities. That means more susceptibility to COVID-19, which we know was directly linked to long-term air exposure. You know, right now, African Americans are exposed to 21% more air pollution than white Americans. Hispanic Americans are exposed to 12% more, right? The Trump administration, despite of that, has repealed or is in the process of repealing at least 95 different environmental rules, with 25 having a direct and adverse impact on air quality. So furthering pollution in these areas, in Black communities, in brown communities, and dozens more that will have, you know, indirectly increased air pollution. Also, very briefly on the issue of climate, we have to see the intersections there, especially with immigration, right? You know, in 2018, the Lancet Countdown report stated that the world could see over 1 billion climate migrants. So we think we have an immigration issue now. Imagine, you know, when this climate crisis really hits, right? And we understand that climate is a threat multiplier and a driver of conflict. So when we talk about immigration, we got to ask ourselves, why are people migrating in the first place? What would make someone actually pick up, leave everything they have, leave everything they've known, leave their home, and come to an unknown land? Well, we know that historically there have been disruptions, sometimes by external government, but more also by conflicts in regions, on the environmental issues because of increased instability, hunger, poverty, and violence. We know that right now over 143 million people in the global South, so sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and South Asia, could be displaced by the climate crisis by 2050. We know that when we talk about Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Costa Rica, these peoples have already seen climate impacts, some of them going without a harvest for a year, sometimes 2 years. So that's food insecurity that's making people move. So we got to really understand that the oppression we're seeing manifests in different areas, right? And instead of pitting ourselves against one another, we need to fully understand the urgency and trying to figure out how to stand in solidarity with each other, because that's the only way we're going to survive.
That's right. I mean, I know that it sounds cliche, but we really literally are stronger together. And one of the what makes white supremacy so powerful, what makes them quote unquote supreme, is to be divisive, is to create barriers where people who are being disenfranchised are not banding together to stop the madness. Before we move to, because I want to touch on another part of the conversation connected with Gabbi, but we did have a question to come in, and it's for William. If you can talk about water, about clean water, and the way that it impacts immigration. So we talked about like why people are mobile. So just talk about how water is like a global crisis and how that intersects with immigration.
Yeah, when you talk about water, you know, I think the best way to frame this, and this is an evolving understanding for me, so I want to preface it there, but there's a parallel when we talk about the lack of clean water domestically, like in the United States, whether you talk about Flint or in the U.S. South, where we see the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure. You know, a quick segue, here in North Carolina and in the South, we've been fighting two major pipeline projects, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which were actually both rerouted to go through the poorest communities and the communities with the most people of color, right? Talking about environmental racism in the process. And one of the reasons we've been fighting so hard there is because it directly threatens the water supply, right, of these areas. Now, globally, the parallel is that when you look at the global South, so when you look at areas like sub-Saharan Africa, you look at India, you look at Asia, you see all these droughts that are beginning to happen. You know, millions of people starting to run out of water. You know, Cape Town was at a point last year where it had its longest drought, I think, you know, in history. Almost ran out of water. Well, did run out of water for, I think, around 3 months. Water is life. You know, water is life. And so when we talk about what unites us, right, in our struggles, that's one of the base, most fundamental elements, is just access to life, right? And that I think, for me, hammers home the urgency of the issue. It hammers home why we need to expand our thinking to have a lens of not only what we're doing domestically, but what does global solidarity look like, right? And it hammers home, you know, the connections with, you know, local environmental injustices and this larger climate crisis, where I think we have to build our awareness.
Get myself up on mute. There we go. I want to connect it to Gabbi. We had the pleasure of having Gabbi to be a part of our Young, Gifted, and Green Summit during the Congressional Black Caucus last year. And Gabbi, I don't know if you remember, but you gave this phenomenal analogy around water and Black folk. Do you remember what you said?
Yeah.
I'd love for you to share it again.
So it's literally what he's saying, but it's maybe a little less eloquent. When we think about historically our relationship with water as people of color, it's always been a struggle, and it's always been a means of oppression for us. But at the same time, it's our liberation, and it's the way that we celebrated ourselves. It came, you know, pouring out libations, things like that. But when you take away water, it really explains a lot of the systematic oppression that we've all experienced, right? So the means in which they captured us and transported us, water. Right? So then you get here, you're in slavery, and what do? They deny you water. They deny you clean water to wash yourself. They deny you, you know, any drinking water while you're out in the fields, right? So then our bodies genetically are just magic, right? Black and brown people are magic. And again, we're still dealing with the traumas of slavery, right? Our bodies learn to hold our water. So that's where we now hold salt, because genetically our bodies had to re-engineer themselves to survive the lack of water. So the water that we did receive, we had to hold on to with dear life. So that's a message in itself, right? So then you move forward, we get free-ish. We're in the civil rights movement, civil rights period. How do they communicate difference to us? How do they communicate oppression? Water fountains, pools, bathrooms, right? And now we're getting into the supposed to be free, right, mode of time. And how do they do it to us now? Flint, right? So it's the same situations over and over. They use water to communicate us. So I see it in the comments, and it's exactly right. Water can be our salvation and can be our unifier. And I think a lot of times when people think about the anger that would come from a community of known oppression, of like it not being in those silos, of everybody being like, damn, that happened to you too, or that happens to you too. You know, people are afraid of that storm. They're afraid of of rocking, of the waves, right? But what I really think Black and brown people want is simply to be like water and to be level. We don't want people to be tainting us. We don't want people to be paying to be, you know, we don't want to be paid to be poisoned. We just want to be level. We want to be ourselves. And again, it seems very like spiritual in a way of sense, but that is what all this is. And when we're talking about white supremacy, we're talking about a system, we're talking about some dark magic in that sense, right? Because it's been passed down and it's sustained itself. And it amazes me to this day that what people have done is like try to eradicate these individual players, but we're fighting a system that has been in place for longer than what a lot of us are thinking about. So that's my spill on water in us.
So I had to get that analogy back. It just really, y'all, I wish that everybody that was listening could have been there, because we literally was in awe. Like, I don't even know how to finish this panel no more. Like, drops mic. But yes, indeed, that was powerful. You're getting all of the love for just making that connection. And that is so vital when you think about who we are as Black and brown people. We are such a spiritual people. You know, we have such a spiritual connection to the earth. And when you think about specifically like colonization and the transatlantic slave trade, you think about that separation of brown bodies to the earth, right? Like literally like everything about Black and brown, whether you are from Central America, South America, Mexico, from the continent, just such a huge connection to the earth. And as you think about like strategically making that separation is within itself such a huge aspect of white supremacy. So thank you for that, Gabby. And that's a really good segue into the next question I want to pose to you. Ooh, we're ready to get stretched out. Ooh, yeah. Birdman hands. So African American, am I asking the right one? Oh, sorry. Okay. What are some barriers that are preventing stronger unified efforts between African American and Latino communities as it relates to environmental justice? Now keep it real, peel it apart for us, make it plain. Like, what is the barrier?
So I've been paying attention to the comments, and this is a panel in itself, so shout out to everybody over there. And the systematic separation is definitely one that everybody knows, right? We know that they have strategically, you know, even in the sense of like language barriers, right? Like it's been so many situations in which Black and brown people have been picked and pulled apart. It's insane. And so that's one thing, we know that. But the biggest barrier to me in working in being of both communities, being of multiple Black and brown communities, because there's more than one type of brown, right? You got South Asian brown people. You got, you know what I mean? You have all types of brown people. So we also have to like really get out of this linear view of what it means to be Black and brown, because there are a lot more people that subscribe to, you know, the walk of life that we do. And if we could get that collected together, it would be super scary, right? So, and that's what they're afraid of. That's the sense. All that power being centralized. I'm talking about Christianity. You gonna have Kojic and Santeria together, standing together. What? They're not ready, right? So in these situations, you see this like cultural divide. But just like you just said, if we really think about it, and you know, my last name is Martinez, my family Black name on this side is Smith. The only difference between becoming a Smith and a Martinez was the boat stop. So essentially, when everybody comes together and realizes that we were all misplaced, all on a ship, and that, yeah, we might have all come out looking a little different, but Black people in New Orleans look different than Black people in DC, and Black people in Memphis look different than Black people in Mississippi, right? And again, you have all these differentiations and you have all these things to celebrate, but instead we're looking at it as difference. Who can be so diverse and still be unified and still be one thing but us, right? And that's the beauty of being of color. But a lot of times, you know, you have, unfortunately, I'm getting tongue-tied because I don't want to put it all on us, but we have drank the Kool-Aid. We drank the Kool-Aid that we are not the same. We drank the Kool-Aid that others are coming for our jobs, or coming for our place in society. And I ask you, Black people, what place is that? Right? So if you have any animosity towards Latinx people, and anyone we talked about, Cesar Chavez, right, in his organizing, he was directly influenced by Martin Luther King. And yes, it might have been a little bit more quickly effective, but that's what happens. That's called legacy, right? You don't want your struggles to be the same for the next person. You want it to be better. And we've seen enough people go through, you know, we've seen enough funny movies about the mixing of cultures and all this kind of stuff. But again, that's a narrative that they're trying to push to us to make us still feel so different than each other. And a lot of times I'm so excited when I work with the youth, because they give me hope for the fact that, like, there will be that real, true Black and Brown alliance in the coming of years. When you see the work being done, you know, in DC specifically with my youth and on the work on behalf of Black girls, it's not just Black girls doing it. There are other brown people in the room, because they realize that we winning this fight over here is going to bolster the fight over here. It's going to help us win this case over here. So essentially, we have to get out of our own ways, right? And we have to be okay with leaders that don't look like us representing us, right? Because sometimes that's what it's going to take too. You want other people in the room. Slavery was not, you know, ended by just Black people yelling. Some white folk had to yell too. So essentially, you know, we have to really hone in on what allyship looks like. We have to really think about, you know, a strategic plan on behalf of all of us. Because to say that we're looking for just Black liberation, you know, it's going to take a lot of other people besides white people to see us as liberated as well too, right? Because other brown people who are playing into the white supremacist system, they also keep other brown people down. So if we can educate all of us about what has actually happened and come to a common ground about what is actually happening and see each other in each other, we will be a force to be reckoned with. And we can talk about it until we're blue in the face. We can have all these panels, but until everybody is being inclusive and not just saying it to say it, right? Not just, you know, saying, oh, I do this sometimes and I let this brown person in, but also brown people have to be okay with being in Black-centered spaces as well, and that being the front of the movement. Like, there has to be a priority. There has to be, you know, and it's not a hierarchy. That's the wrong word, and that's what people think of it as. They think of it as a hierarchy of causes or a hierarchy of, you know, of things that we're being active of. It's a priority list. It's a situation of what can be a open step to the next one, what can be a stair step to us really getting to progress. And, you know, I think that's what's missing from this movement. And if we see Black people start to recognize and go back and get some of those other Black people, like the Black people in the Dominican Republic and all them Black people in Puerto Rico and all those Black people who are also the Black people in Venezuela who are screaming Black Lives Matter at the same time. If we really honed in all that power, again, a force to be reckoned with. And I'm here for it. I'm ready. So any organization out here really looking for collaboration, don't let the moniker the Black Girl Tribe, you know, make you feel like it's a linear movement. This movement is for everybody. We are a tribe, but we have a greater village and we're working all together. So that's the best thing I can do, is to model that synergy, that symmetry that we need in this movement.
All right, come through, Ms. Gabbi. So we have several questions. We're gonna go ahead and transition into the Q&A part. Before we go into the Q&A, thank you all so much. Yes, y'all came ready to give all the gems to the people. I'm so excited about some of the new things that I have learned tonight. So we have some questions. All right, so the first question says, I wonder if any of the panelists can speak a bit more about employment opportunities for non-citizens in the environmental justice space. For example, how difficult would it be to go through the immigration process to include first-generation immigrants? So this speaks really heavily on being inclusive with the green economy and green jobs. Let's see, William, can you speak to that?
I don't have that experience, to be honest, in terms
Okay.
of first generation immigrants. So, yeah.
I would say that if I'm understanding the question correctly, you're saying where is the space for undocumented community within the space of like this new economic or new landscape of jobs for green jobs, right? And they're directly right in the middle. I recently this summer with my family drove up the coast from LA to San Francisco, and I was brought back to post antebellum slavery in the South, because literally it was just fields and fields of people picking fruit and picking things and growing things. And it was very scary to me. It wasn't the sight that, you know, made me feel prideful in the situation, because I know they're not being paid properly, right? They're not being paid in an equitable wage. The environment that they're working in was not, you know, up to code, any of those things. So they're at the dead center of it. But what is necessary is for us, those same people, those Black and brown people, to speak for those who are undocumented, because of the fear of, you know, extradition, all these other kind of things, and the things that happen when, you know, the undocumented people don't even seek medical care. Right? Let's be honest. Like, they literally get hurt in their workplaces and will not go and seek medical care because of deportation, right? So it's really up to us, those of us who can and have the privilege to have a voice, to speak up and make sure that there is room for them in those spaces as well. And not even so much room, but that their voices are more elevated, because they're already there. Like, let's just be honest. They are the workforce.
I agree. And I think, again, and you all spoke about this earlier, where we have to be united. One of the things that I see a lot of, so I physically live in Memphis. I spent some time living in the DC area. DC is a lot more diverse than Memphis. And so I think, like, in places like Memphis, where for forever and a day, it had only been Black people and white people. I think that we kind of have to shift the culture, where, one, we have to learn about what systemic oppression looks like outside of the Black and white struggle, and really pick it apart, right? So when we talk about being inclusive, when we talk about our workforce, we could really be missing out on some super talented people, because, like, we're not blending together, right? And when you think about the history of Black people, that's how we were able to become elevated, where we're consistently picking people up, consistently giving insight around opportunities. So, Gabby, you had another point?
You just sparked me to say something. I think a lot of times when it comes to the idea of blending together, people think that there's going to be a loss of authenticity of self, right? They think that if they team up with people, they're no longer themselves, they're no longer the individual, they can no longer celebrate who they are. I've never been in a space where Black people have made me, you know, choose to be Black or to be brown. I've never been in a space where brown people have made me choose to be Black or brown. So I think that we have a really unique power to blend, but it's just like it's vocabulary, right? Words mean things and they become scary to people. So when you say blend, people think that, you know, I'm going to lose something of myself in that translation. I'm no longer going to be who I am in my form. But essentially, that's not it. Like, we can still be unified and still be celebratory of our independent, you know, greatness, of what makes us awesome as cultures separately. You know, nobody's asking anybody to put down their flag. We're just asking you to pick up another one that represents all of us as well.
Awesome. We did have one more question, but we are coming up on time. So what we're going to do from the Black Millennials for Flint side, we have all of the questions that were captured today. So we're going to put together an FAQ just to make sure, you know, that we reach all the people with all of their inquiries. But before we close out, if I can get each panelist to just name one strategy that everybody that has attended this evening can take away so that we can truly build this Black and Brown alliance. What can we do to work together? Anybody can start.
So I'll just jump in. I think one piece I want to flag for everyone is on June 20, this coming June 20, the Poor People's Campaign is going to be hosting the mass march on Washington, D.C. virtual. You can find out more information at poorpeoplescampaign.org, but that's going to be an opportunity to continue this conversation when we talk about really acknowledging the power that exists in our communities on the five, what we call the five injustices of poverty, systemic racism, militarism and the war economy, ecological devastation, and a distorted moral narrative that prevents us from ever talking about these issues in tandem. I think that's a huge opportunity, you know, to change the narrative in this country, and, you know, put us on the path towards increased solidarity.
I'll go. We can hold these white folks accountable. And accountability is not just compliance with the funding that they receive or the laws, but that accountability is directly related to community and how you're responsible to the community. Require them to be transparent and ask them questions, and then have them justify their reasoning behind why they choose to either engage with Black and brown people or not to engage with Black and brown people. And vote.
She stole mine. I will say that I think that the one way that we can start with our unity is in the vote. That's the first actionable item. That's what I'm encouraging everyone to do. I know that it looks bleak, and every day people are becoming more and more problematic, and it is the problematic Olympics. I understand, but it is still something that we have to do. All of our ancestors, a lot of times we try to pretend like it's just Black people's ancestors, all Black and brown ancestors. All of us, we have a duty, we have a collective responsibility to be their legacy, and the best way to be their legacy is to make sure that we have left something great for our legacy, right? We have the opportunity to make the choice to vote or to not to vote. And again, I'm not telling you who to vote for, but essentially I'm saying that is the best way. And again, look at that ballot and don't just look for the people that look like you. You can vote for other brown folks. Did you know, right? It's a possibility. There are lots of us, and they run for things all the time. Just because you don't see a Black person running doesn't mean that your voice or your experience is not going to be represented in that, right? So again, I just really want people to, get beyond their love for Selena and Mindy Kaling and all the people, and really get to the fact that, like, them your people too. Right? Like, exactly. Everybody got a super light skinned cousin. So again, if colorism and skin color is getting in the way of that, like, everybody got somebody that's super light skinned in their family. Just think of them as that. But essentially, it's just that situation. We are literally all the same.
That was so powerful. And so we got voting, making sure, that we stay connected there. I love the point that you made, Gabby, around please vote for platform and purpose. Again, like, that person might not look like you. I'm gonna just keep it real. I'm a Memphian, so I can say this. A lot of times people select people based on, well, I went to school with them, or they've been in this position for a long time. Who the Black person on the ballot? I'm just gonna vote for the Black person. Listen, honey, yes, I love my people.
Let me tell you a fairy tale about a man named Adrian
people who are, your skin brother and sister, but not for real. So we have to make sure that we identify that. So I'm glad that you brought that up.
What you say? Let me tell you a fairy tale story about a man named Adrian Fenty. Okay.
Child, listen.
All right.
Okay.
It happens.
It happens. It happens. All right, y'all. So we are just a little bit over time. This was phenomenal. To everyone that attended this evening, thank you so much. Please stay in contact with us. William dropped the link so that you can be more involved in the work that he is doing on the ground. So important to see him being a legacy torch holder for justice on all fronts. You can also go like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. Please help us out on Twitter. Lord Jesus, it's hard out here for Twitter. Also, we will put the FAQ from tonight's event on all our social media outlets tomorrow, and it'll also be posted on our website. Thank you so much again. Make sure you take the survey after you leave. It's going to pop up automatically. And everybody have a good night.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, my fellow panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.